This is episode 7 of DNA of Games, the podcast dedicated to highlighting the disabled and neurodiverse in the games industry. I'm your host Chris, and this podcast series was created to chat with other disabled and neurodiverse people in the industry as a way of normalising the discussion around disability and neurodiversity. I hope this podcast helps you see other identities often left out of the discussion in games and really help encourage others to find their place within the games industry. And then I say to everybody, like, this is me when I go into my editing suite and I'll just, like, chop out the first bit because of me just saying anything random old things like, oh no, I need to chop that off and go into the proper introduction of the episode. So, hi, I'm Chris and welcome back to another episode of DNA of Games. That's a Disability, Neurodiversity and Accessibility of Games podcast, really exploring the different disabled and neurodiverse people that work in games. With me today, I have Dan Pearson, who works in marketing now. I don't know why I got business development in my head, but it used to be business development. As well as in the past, you worked as a journalist in your sort of career, but I'm sure you'll go into that more detail than I could. And you have a mix of neurodiversical, neurological conditions.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the plural is. Yeah.
And that's concoction of what makes you you.
Yep.
Welcome, Dan. Hi.
Hey, how you doing? Thanks for having me.
I don't know if you want to give a bit of an introduction to yourself, which is a bit better than my introduction.
Sure, yeah. My name's Dan Pearson. I'm 42. I've been in the industry now for 16 years, I think, since 2006. I did my first 11 years or so as a journalist working at Eurogamer and gamesindustry.biz, and then kind of moved out into the sort of games production publishing side. I was working at Square Enix very briefly after being a journalist, where I was an internal business editor. I never really fully worked out what that job meant in the 6 months I was there, hence me only being there 6 months. And then I went to work for a guy called Jazz Purwell for a couple of years. He's a lawyer. I'm sure many of you would have come across him. He's a lovely chap, always willing to spend his time on other people's issues. Sometimes he doesn't even charge you £750 an hour for it, which is pretty good for a lawyer. Worked for him for a couple of years doing business development until his business was acquired, and took redundancy, and then set up my own consultancy for about a year, 18 months, just doing kind of marketing, copy, communications consultancy for various people. And then after a little while of that, was taken on full time by one of the companies I was consulting for, a company called Genvid, which is an American company that makes an SDK for adding interactivity to video streams. So I've been working for them full time now for around a year, I think. It's been an interesting journey. Like I still don't know whether I would. I still hesitate sort of when someone says, "What do you do?" I still don't say I make games, because I've never done a bit of coding in my life, but I've worked around the edges, and I very much support the idea that everyone who works in games makes games. Frankly, I think all of those parts are necessary for it. But I've never I would never introduce myself as someone who makes games, I suppose.
I've definitely been learning myself now that I'm a part of the Tentacle Zone incubator, creating my own game of the components in games that I'm just so weak at, whether that's like marketing or like having that like social community growth and all those like business developing bits that I kind of like reluctantly do. And it's like that's just as much as going into making a game as like you say, writing a line of code or creating an art asset. So you're right. It all goes into it.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that no matter what you think of your own role, and you might be sitting there thinking, oh god, these programmers must think I'm an idiot, or these artists must think I'm incredibly clumsy, or whatever. Like there's always somebody looking at your job going, that person is working magic, and I don't understand how they do it. So I think that's a really important thing to remember. No matter what you're doing, somebody is looking at it and going, I couldn't do that.
Yeah, that's a nice sentiment to put in. Yeah. People, I work in as a producer, so I understand the sort of like People going, oh, like, oh, so and so, like, oh, I can never do that.
I mean, yeah, that's it's one of the things that I really admire is that kind of production role, organization, planning. Part of my neurodiversity is that I am absolutely awful at that. So I look at these people kind of juggling a thousand different streams of information and organizing several different schedules and getting all that stuff done. And I find that absolutely mind blowing. So.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because in our previous episode with Harriet, her neurodiversity kind of helped her become more organised. So it's the way that she sort of she loved that sort of like, I guess that like lots of little things happening and like organising it all for the betterment of the team. Like, hence why when she is a producer, like, she loved that sort of like complexity and organising things, I guess. And I guess that's the way she her, I guess, like ADHD, autism, sort of really sort of shone in a way of helping her in life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for some people with ADHD, it can be a hugely calming influence, right? And a very, very kind of helpful, kind of cathartic outlet for it, I think, of that kind of hamster wheel brain energy of just going, right, I'm going to organize stuff. I wish I was able to channel mine as usefully, frankly.
Yeah, it's like yeah, and that's kind of a great point of like, conditions affect people differently, and that's why you can't just have one example of like neurodiversity ADHD because it affects people differently, and that's why it's great to have things like this, like where we can actually see and talk to people and see that you may not identify with one person who's got ADHD, but you might agree like might be someone like you like, oh yeah, I've got ADHD and my mind's just all over the place, so I'm terrible at like keeping my plan together. But yeah, like
Yeah.
it's a good segue into sort of I don't know if you want to talk about like the different sort of neurodiversities that you sort of identify with or have diagnosed with, if you care to share.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, I mean, it's something that I was only diagnosed with ADHD, which is sort of my primary neurodiversity, when that was about 2.5 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
So I'd always struggled with concentration. I'd always struggled with focus. When I was a kid, I was hugely hyperactive. I was always running around, just constantly talking, constantly getting into trouble, like a lot of kids, but in a uh, very kind of concentrated way. And I think as a child, because that was never suggested as a possibility to me, I just learned um, not to behave that way, I guess, and I kind of really enforced those social norms on myself in a way that wasn't very healthy and certainly wasn't dealing with the problem. So I taught myself that you absolutely can't talk over people. You don't interrupt people, which was a really hard thing. It's one of the kind of key things about ADHD is you just kind of have this flow of information in your brain that you just have to get out, otherwise it disappears. That had been the case for me even at primary school. When I have absolutely terrible handwriting, and I remember my teachers saying, just slow down. You're trying to write too fast. And sort of think, well, if I don't get it out, if I don't write it, it's gone.
Yeah.
Like my brain's moving twice as fast as my hand can, and if it doesn't go on the page, then it vanishes. Because that's another thing about my sort of ADHD is that I have a dozen sort of threads of thought running at once, but as soon as they pass out of the kind of lens of my consciousness, they may as well have just never been there. Basically, it's extremely hard to remember stuff. So even at that point, there was a lot of the aspects of it that were affecting me. And for a long time, I think as a kid, I just internalized that, and I just thought, oh, I'm just annoying, or I need to calm down, I need to shut up. Why am I like this? As I got older, it sort of started to manifest in things like struggling to plan, struggling to organize things at work. I think it's quite common for a lot of ADHD folks to be good at school up to a certain point, because you're very good at context switching, you're very good at taking in large streams of information and spewing them out again in simplified ways, which, for everything up to sort of A levels is pretty much how you're taught. You get a load of stuff thrown at you, and they go, spew this out in a vaguely kind of useful way later. So, school was quite easy up until that point, and the things I was good at, I was like, okay, this is great. Things I wasn't good at immediately, I was like, no, I'm just never going to ever do that. If it's any effort to get good at it, nothing. So then you get to university and A level sort of level, and suddenly things get a bit harder. You're asked to do a lot more on your own, and that was just really kind of difficult to deal with. To suddenly go from, this is the thing that I'm good at, this is the thing I've been praised for, there's all this other stuff that I've been internalizing as my fault and being bad at, and then suddenly that thing that you're good at becomes very, very hard as well. So I think that was a difficult stage, because I was still imposing all of those kind of social pressures on myself and making all those judgments about myself, but suddenly the one thing I thought was okay at was really hard. So I think at that point it just became a bit of a burden, really. Like I say, I just kept internalizing more and more stuff and saying, I'm useless at this, I can't plan. At that point, it's looking back on it, I realized how much effect it was having on relationships. You if you're with a partner and you obviously want to plan for the future, you want to, from anything like organizing a meal for an anniversary to booking a holiday to, thinking about families. That stuff was just a complete anathema to me. The idea of thinking about anything that's happening more than 3 hours in the future, I had no concept of that. I didn't understand why anyone would want to do that. And obviously that's intensely frustrating for someone who's like, well, I just want to book a meal, and it's like, okay, but we'll just do that 10 minutes before we leave on the day, which obviously doesn't work. So I completely get that. So I'd sort of gone through a very long time through this with various other issues as well. A lot of anxiety, a lot of chronic depression, a lot of just general feelings of feeling quite kind of outside of things. I think I developed quite a strong tendency for disassociation, of just what some people call the kind of third person view of yourself. It's almost you're watching yourself going about your life, and because you have this kind of aspect of maintaining a level of control over yourself and not allowing yourself to be who you are, because you've taught yourself that these are failures that you need to hide, it's very easy to just kind of see your actual self as you present to others as this sort of kind of puppet that you're directing the whole time, and that for a long time was very mentally unhealthy for me. I think I was distancing myself, I was having this sort of dissociative behavior, I felt very unsettled, ungrounded. I'd realized that a lot of what I thought was just shortcomings were kind of affecting others around me. So when I got to about 2020, which obviously was not a great year for anybody, frankly, but in the space of about I think probably about 6 months, I obviously the pandemic started. I got COVID very early on, I think. I turned 40. I got made redundant. I had to start my own business. I separated from my wife, which was, a lot of which was down to ADHD issues. And I got this ADHD diagnosis, all during this kind of global pandemic, at a point where I was living in as it transpired in the end, living in a house in the countryside on my own, miles away from anyone. Don't drive, so I couldn't go to see anyone, and even if I could, it was under lockdown. So I just got this diagnosis just before a lot of that sort of happened. So it was a really tumultuous time. It was awful, really kind of hitting rock bottom around that time. But weirdly, getting that diagnosis really actually helped to clarify a lot of stuff, because it put a label on it. It gave me something to aim at. It meant that suddenly all of these things, particularly, the stuff that had played a part in the kind of collapse of my marriage, was suddenly like, oh, okay, that's not just me being an asshole or me being lazy. Like, this is why that's happening, and this is how I can look at that through that lens. So I only ended up getting that diagnosis through following someone on Twitter, actually, a woman called Lauren, who used to work on Fable at Lionhead, who was talking about it on her Twitter, about the kind of the symptoms that she'd had, her approach to getting diagnosis. And I was reading it thinking, yeah, that's every single point there makes sense, you know. And I was having therapy at the time anyway, so I spoke to my therapist about it and said, "What do you think?" We went through the DSCM kind of criteria for it, which is just the standard kind of psychological
Okay.
kind of criteria. Went through and it's like, yeah, 100%. You know, looking back on stuff in your childhood, stuff you find difficult now, it's absolutely certain. Spoke to my GP about it, and they said, you know, we'll have to put you in touch with a right to choose. So it's a private service that is kind of held by the NHS to deal with this sort of thing. I went with a thing called Psychology UK. Had a video interview with them, got a diagnosis immediately, went through titration on all of the available medications.
Yeah.
Nothing worked. So the other issues that I've had of a long period, I've had insomnia all of my life, chronic insomnia, a lot of anxiety, and all of the medication kind of accentuated those. Basically, the
Yeah.
stuff I tried first, the Elvance. I tried the methylphenidate first, which just made me feel awful. It was just really intense anxiety, a lot of kind of tension, absolutely no focus, nausea, just horrible. And then Elvance, which is dexamphetamine, which helped focus, but I just wasn't sleeping at all. I was getting, 2 hours of sleep a night or something, so it just felt awful. And then a couple of others called guanfacine and atomexetine, both of which made me feel dreadful. One of which made me feel super paranoid and depressed, gave me weird hallucinations. Another one, I was just waking up at like 2 o'clock every morning and not going back to sleep, feeling sick. So after this kind of feeling of, oh wow, I can deal with this. I'm getting treatment for this. This is a thing I can sort out. Particularly as when I first spoke to them, they said, oh yeah, if we can fix this, it will fix your insomnia. You'll get on much better at work. You'll be better at relationships. You'll be happier. All of this stuff. And it was kind of crushing to go through that process of titration, because as anyone who's done it knows, like these are not kind of casual pharmaceuticals. They're serious. They're heavyweight stuff. They have a real effect on you.
Yeah. I get it's such an interesting point, because I guess people who would just assume that obviously once you get an ADHD diagnosis, it's kind of just, oh, here's your magic pill, it'll balance you out and make everything easier for you. But it's like you say, there's so many different variations, medications that do different things or different levels. Like you say, they could affect people differently, and I think people don't acknowledge that as much. Like it's actually it will take a while before you get to that like manageable place for yourself.
Absolutely.
We see it a lot on the industry Slack, with people sort of discussing what medication they're on for their ADHD, and people comparing notes all the time with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, when I say all that about how difficult I found it, I really don't want to put anyone else off trying it, because I had weirdly a couple of friends who were diagnosed around the same time as me, and we all went through the same process, and we all found different ways through it. One of my friends immediately on the first thing he tried, which was the Zagatin, the methylphenidate, he was like, this is amazing, everything's fixed, it's brilliant, I can do everything. And another friend who went stuck on Elvance and found exactly the same for that. So some people will go straight into that thing. They try the first thing and it's amazing for them, and that's incredible. So yeah, it was a rough 6 months, I think, and this was coming after all of that other stuff. So this was in the first 6 months of me trying to run my own consultancy business. First time I've ever done that. As I say, living alone, having separated from my wife, starting to go through that kind of divorce procedure, global pandemic just getting worse and worse.
Just to sort of interject with the, obviously all the situation that was going around for you, and you get this diagnosis. Did your outlook on the diagnosis become more negative because a lot more negative things were happening around you, or was it kind of a positive, like sort of a ray of sunshine to be like, oh, actually, this could help?
Yeah, I think I sort of vacillated between the two. I mean, during the titration period, which lasted a long time, right? So that was probably about 6 months. It often depended on what I was taking at the time, frankly, because some of it really kind of surfaces the other things in it, and you kind of really focus on the symptoms of the ADHD. And at that point, I think it kind of helped because it just focused in on that thing. It didn't give me much time to think about everything else. It gave me a relatively immediate and what seemed like a solvable problem at the time, whereas all of the other stuff was just this background radiation of stress that I knew I couldn't do anything about.
Yeah.
So actually to have a thing where I could go, right, I need to solve this. It might have ramifications, everything else, positive or whatever, but I need to fix this, and this is how I do it. So at the beginning, it really, really helped. It took my mind off things, gave me a focus, gave me some hope. As I kind of rattled through the different medications, I'd started feeling less good about it, because I think as anyone who's had chronic health problems knows, and this wasn't the case for my ADHD actually. Once I addressed it, I got it treated very quickly. But the process of troughs and peaks of getting diagnosis, failing a treatment, going back, and the doctor just being like, "Eh."
Try
we've
this.
done, yeah, we've kind of done what we can. I mean, I had a similar thing. I finally got a diagnosis for insomnia actually about 7 or 8 months ago, after about 30 years of talking to doctors about it, saying, this is really affecting my quality of life. I'm exhausted. I'm ill all the time. I've looked it up. It definitely shortens your lifespan. And they're like, yeah, no, yeah, it will. Sorry, because like we're not going to give you anything that could be habit forming. We also just think probably you're sleeping more than you really are, and you're fine. And have you tried not watching telly just before bed? It's like, yeah, 40 years of this, I've tried all that. Finally got the diagnosis for that. And again, it was the same thing. They said you've got chronic insomnia, you've got a thing called a lapsed circadian rhythm, where your brain gets out of cycle with the sun cycle, and also you've got obstructive apnea. We can't do anything about any of that. So great. It's like, well, so I'm still going to only be getting 3 or 4 hours sleep a night. Yep, probably. It's certainly going to be a couple of years wait before we can try and do anything about that. So yeah, I think that process of finding the diagnosis, finding that hope, finding something to focus on, and then basically being told, sorry, you're one of the people we can't do anything about, is crushing at the time.
Yeah.
And I think honestly, I'd have really, really struggled with that if I hadn't been having the kind of therapy at the same time. And that was a huge positive impact on that.
Yeah.
I was very lucky in that the therapist I was seeing already had kind of done quite a lot of work with children with ADHD. So he had a good working knowledge of it. He understood how it could have these kind of ramifications for mental health and various other things, and the various ways it can kind of permeate your life. So that was really, really helpful. And so to have someone sort of talk through the options for dealing with it without medication meant a great deal. And for someone to kind of to help you, I'm always very cautious about the idea of putting this stuff in a positive light, in an unalloyed positive light. I think there's absolutely positive aspects of it, but I think it's very dangerous to say, oh, you should view it as a gift, because it's hard. It's really difficult.
Yeah.
And there are things it can help you to do better. There are things it can make you better at. But it would be quite crass, I think, to just say universally it's a blessing and you need to accept that and recognize it, because it's not for a lot of people, certainly in the overall picture. So yeah, that therapy absolutely helped me through that. And I think without it, I'd have really, really, really struggled. And the other thing that it really helped with is it stopped me assigning all of my issues to ADHD. I think I'd got to that point, and it was, as with any mental health issue, it's a big complex knot. All these things tie into each other. And I was, talking to my therapist every week. I'd say, oh, I think maybe this is, the ADHD, or maybe that. And he'd often say, it's not. It's like, it might be a symptom of a symptom of a symptom, but if you assign everything to that, then you make it unsolvable. You don't ever approach it, and you don't make progress. So I think that was the other thing that was helpful was just not putting everything in that ADHD basket.
Yeah, I've seen people get confused with the mix of like mental health and neurodiversity, and kind of like maybe a few times seen it like mashed together, when it's kind of like mental health is kind of its own unit, and like you say, like it kind of affects how you're doing on day to day with your ADHD, whatever. and like vice versa. But it's kind of like it's not cause or link between each other. Like it's not because of ADHD.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's nice that you've had that uh, uh, sort of grounding to be like, hey, I'm discuss your thoughts and get that either verified and talk through it basically. So
Yeah.
it's really cool.
Yeah, I think particularly kind of discovering it later in life when it's as I said, it's a real relief to kind of look back on stuff and go, oh, that wasn't just me being a bit of an arse. That was a thing that was caused by this. But it's very easy to then go back and go, oh, okay, all that stuff I did wrong was related to this. But actually, like there are issues to address as well, as there is for anyone. And one of the interesting things that I found myself looking at a lot, I also have a thing called aphantasia, which is a complete blindness of the mind's eye. So it means I'm unable to picture any mental imagery whatsoever. So if someone says, imagine a blue square, I can describe a blue square. I know what it looks like, but I can't see it in my head. I can't see, my girlfriend's face. I can't picture my front door with any clarity. I can, like I say, I can describe them all for you. I can pick them out of a line of pictures, but I don't have any way to do that. And that was another thing which for years I just assumed happened to everyone else. I just assumed that when people said, oh, count sheep to go to bed, or trying to do meditation to help with what turned out to be symptoms of ADHD, and they were like, oh, picture yourself here or there. It's like, you really actually no, surely this is just like a metaphor, right? When you say picture it, you just mean imagine it and think about it.
Yeah, I feel like
And
I'm like the exact opposite, where I can sort of vividly visualize everything, but then it's kind of when you say, "Oh, describe it," I'm just like, I can see it in my mind's eye. I know what you're on about. But yeah, it's strange that how people that can be literally like the polar opposite of you and just like, oh okay,
yeah.
we all think differently.
Yeah, I think, particularly for internal stuff like that. I mean, it's a good general metaphor for kind of neurodiversity and mental health. Really, you can't make assumptions about what anyone else is going through, even if they report a very similar experience. If you'd sat me down in a room with 10 other people and said, right, all of you picture a giraffe and describe it, I'd have given a very dissimilar description to everyone else in that room, and no one else would have known that. I didn't know that at the time. So it's really important to understand that no matter how somebody is presenting their life, no matter what results they're able to get out to the world, they could well be facing a lot of struggles and a lot of obstacles that other people aren't.
So out of interest then, obviously with like your career path and that, sort of with journalists and moving on from there and etc. and doing your own thing, because now you've got like this diagnosis and you've kind of done a lot of reflective work. How do you think it's like sort of interwoven within your career? Do you think it's sort of like helped or hindered where you worked, or you kind of just figured it out at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be honest, if I didn't have ADHD, I probably wouldn't have ever got into the games industry. Okay. My actual route to my first job as a journalist in the games industry was so random. I'd moved down. I was at university in Nottingham. I'd stayed there for a couple of years, doing crappy temp work. I couldn't decide what I wanted to do. I just kind of floated around. I got bored. I moved down to Brighton, where a lot of friends were. Did the same thing for a year. Bad temp jobs. I ended up temping for the police, doing like backroom paperwork. I absolutely hated it. And I got so bored at one lunchtime of it and so distraught, I ended up just sitting down at my lunch and just Googling various dream jobs, and I sat there I was like, well, what do I really want to do? Like taking the limits off, what would I really, really love to do? And I literally just typed in writing about games, Brighton into Google. And the first thing that came up, the top Google result, was a admin job at Eurogamer that had been posted about 3 days before. And I just thought, fine, I'll go for it. I've got no qualifications. It's a completely random jump. It's just leaping in something. The pay wasn't amazing, but I just thought I'm just going to do it. And then I just rang them every day for 2.5 weeks, as Rupert Lohman can attest, until they just got bored and gave me the job, basically. And just worked my way up from that very bottom role to being editor of GamesIndustry.biz sort of a decade later. And like I say, I think if I hadn't have got that board, if I hadn't have just had that ADHD kind of attitude of, I'll just make it work. I'm not going to plan this because I don't plan anything. You kind of throw yourself into something impulsively and go, this is fine. So yeah, I think that really helped. But it also, I mean, there's a huge correlation between people who work in the industry and particularly who really love video games and have particularly ADHD as a neurodiversity, right? That constant stream of dopamine hits that you get when you're playing a game, the constant controllable but very high level of stimulation, is perfect for people who are on ADHD, particularly, and some people on parts of the autism spectrum, who just want a controllable flow of stimulation. Like it's perfect for that. And just being able to stop what you're doing right in the middle of one thing and just start something completely different as well, it really helps. So I think ADHD played a huge role in my love of games as well.
That was going to be my next question of do you think that's why games attract you so much? Obviously, now obviously you got the ADHD, but it's probably when you were younger, it's probably the same reasons you were so into games, like you say, because you had that the controlled dopamine hits and that.
Yeah, and it was just a simple kind of interaction that I could understand as well. It was direct kind of cause and response. I loved reading when I was a kid. I read a huge amount. Again, that was this kind of going into worlds and kind of letting your mind run riot. It was a place where I could just take the brakes off my brain and just kind of allow it to express itself without having to sort of slow myself down and calm myself down for other sorts of interaction. So I mean, I remember as a kid, I was constantly told you're playing games too much. That's never going to do you any good, or you'll never get a job out of this. I remember being quite smug when I told my mum I actually did got first job in games, and increasingly smug as the salary got better and the roles got better. I think she was still quite annoyed at the fact that I'd actually turned it into a career in the end. But in terms of like the actual career itself, I mean, I think it helped a lot. Certainly in the role at Games Industry.biz, where my role was largely interviewing people, especially when it would be directly after a presentation or you just had a load of information thrown at you and you just have to kind of process all of that, make sensible questions out of it, react on the fly. Talking to extremely smart and accomplished people in a relatively high pressure environment. Being able to context switch and adapt to what someone's saying, and that kind of high speed sort of empathy that some people with ADHD had, that helped a lot. That really did. And I think going to things like events, going through a room and saying hello to 50 different people from one side or the other, someone who has a fair share of social anxiety as well, that ability to kind of just put on the ADHD suit and be like, right, I'm going to do this, and just kind of bounce around the room and get things done. That really helped as well. Yeah.
What about now in your current role? Do you feel like it's sort of like how to utilize it in a way that helps you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain amount of context switching in my current role. I do product marketing, but I do a lot of other stuff within the company that I sort of touch on. As this is the first role I've had where I've been conscious of the ADHD, I feel like I'm looking at it through a different lens.
Okay.
But I'm also very lucky in that a senior member of the C-level team has ADHD. He's been very generous with his time talking about it, about how it affects him. He does take medication, but only every other day. So he's been a really good sounding point and a really kind of empathetic ear for talking about how it affects stuff. It's a protected condition in the UK. We have rights as people who live with ADHD to ask for special dispensation. You can legally, as a right, you can say I need extra time to do this, or you can say that's a thing that I'm just not going to be good at. I need a recording of this meeting because I can't take notes and listen, or I'm going to miss stuff if someone talks quickly. So yeah, it's much more been about ameliorating those kind of negative effects and understanding why I'm not naturally good at some stuff. It's looking at like complex organizational tasks and going, I know why I'm not good at that. It's not just me being terrible. It's not just me being lazy. It's a thing that my brain struggles to do. There might be ways around it. There might just be a point where I say, I can't do this. I'm sorry, this is not where my skills are.
Yeah.
And accepting that, I think, cruelly, partly because of the kind of the vicious cycle of ADHD, is that your brain often tells you have to be good at absolutely everything at least a little bit. So coming against those barriers can be quite difficult. But similarly with the aphantasia stuff, looking at kind of visual tasks and just understanding why I'm not good at those, or why I can't kind of mentally move things around on a whiteboard and stuff like that. It's very positive for your mental health to understand that they are not just shortcomings and things that you failed at.
Yeah.
So that's been a real revelation. I certainly I've thought more and more recently, since I went through the titration period, of like, how do I solve this? How do I deal with it? Because at points in the titration period where I was taking, particularly things like Elvance, which were working but just had these side effects, it felt amazing. It was great to sit down and be like, I'm going to sit here for 7 hours and I'm just going to do stuff constantly. I'm going to get stuff done. At the end of the day, being like, holy shit, that was productive. We got so much done, and I know what I'm going to do tomorrow. But then finishing work and not being able to switch that off, just feeling like a machine the whole time, was just not helpful for me. Some people love it. It's very helpful for some people. For me, I couldn't do it. I felt like I was being kind of puppeted by someone else. It just didn't feel like me for a long time.
I guess it's a big risk of like wearing yourself out and not realizing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, for particularly at that time, during the last couple of years, that mental exhaustion of constantly being on time, the physical exhaustion, like the dexamphetamine, you're literally taking pharmaceutical speed, and that has a physical toll, especially if it's stopping you sleeping. And it also has a slightly repressive effect on immune system. So, during a global pandemic, I was just like, this doesn't feel like the best time to be taking something which represses my immune system anyway. So sometimes I look back on that and I think, I wish I could have found a treatment that worked. I would love to be, in inverted commas, normal in that respect. But then other times I look back and I see the things that it's enabled me to do, the things it's empowered me to do, things it's made me better at. And I think, no, that's a huge part of who I am, and I think the risk at that time, having gone through this incredibly tumultuous period where everything in my life had changed, I'd split up with a partner of 12 years. I'd left, a stable job. I'd been made redundant for the first time. I was financially untethered. I was running my own business. The world was falling apart. I think at that point, there was a real danger of me just going, I'm going to change me as well by superimposing this kind of pharmaceutical effect on it, and losing kind of sight of myself. And I'm very glad I didn't. I'm very glad I kind of identified how being who I was going to make me happy. I think that was a really, really kind of important point, because it was a high risk at that point of me just going, this is how I solve this problem, and therefore I can solve everything else through it.
Yeah. Do you then have like any kind of advice then for people that may have recently got the diagnosis of ADHD, or if looking into obviously getting into this industry in a way to it's kind of like for managing it, or just like expectations, I guess, really?
Yeah, I think a lot of it centers around being quite gentle on yourself and being quite forgiving with yourself. I mean, there's a huge amount of people in the industry who will talk very openly about it, and that's been a real boon to me. Being able to go into the industry Slack and just speak to people who'd had the problem. Even talking to, as I said about seeing Lauren talking about it on Twitter and talking to her about it, and her encouraging me to get the diagnosis, talking about the stages involved. That was hugely helpful. So talk to other folks. That people are willing to talk about it. Get the help you need. Accept that anyone else's route to success isn't necessarily going to be the same as yours. You might have great luck with medication. You might have great success with other methods of managing it. You might not need to at all. You might be able to turn it to your advantage. So yeah, be gentle on yourself. Ask advice. Reflect on the way it's affected you, but also maintain that kind of awareness of who you are and how it's a part of you. Don't try and surgically remove it from your life, because there's no way you can do that without cutting out a hugely important part of yourself, I think.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of industries, the games industry is very understanding of a lot of neurodiversities. We have an overrepresentation of a lot of neurodiversities. They're much more likely to speak to someone who understands it. But I think the nature of a lot of the work lends itself relatively well to it as well. And
Yeah.
there are roles which can absolutely turn the aspects of a lot of neurodiversities, particularly ADHD, to an advantage.
Yeah. I've noticed a lot of diversity in the roles in terms of people with ADHD. It's not just like, oh, it's all programmers or QA people or art. It's like it's literally across the spectrum of roles that you see in the industry, which
Yeah.
it's great because again, like you said, you're not trying to fit a mold of what is the expectation of an ADHD person in the games industry and the expectations of they should be in this sort of role. It's actually, like you say, they can do pretty much any role that sort of takes their fancy, and like you say, adapt them, be themselves in that role.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of support available. I mean, it's very difficult in the UK now to get that diagnosis and
Mm.
get the kind of medication, particularly for a number of reasons. I mean, the NHS is struggling a great deal at the moment. Everything's delayed, but there was a big increase in people seeking diagnosis over the pandemic. Um,
Mm.
when I spoke to the doctors who I dealt with, it was clear that the kind of isolation was exacerbating a lot of these effects, because
Mm.
certainly one of the things that I found was that I was able to, again, inverted commas, normalize my behavior by reflecting that of other people around me, from everything I was saying about not interrupting, or trying to do more eye contact, or working really hard and remembering people's names and following conversations. Um, that was mostly done by watching other people do it and go, okay, this is what is acceptable in social interactions. And I think once people were on their own at home, they didn't have all these distractions, they didn't have other things to focus on, they suddenly thought, hang on, I'm going a bit spare here. So there was a huge increase in diagnosis that slowed things down a great deal. The external company I went to, this Psychology UK, I think now has stopped taking on new patients because they just ran at such a backlog. So there's something like a 2.5, 3 year waiting list now to get a diagnosis and to start titration.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
which is tough. It's really, really hard. There are obviously private routes, but they are expensive. It means that you will end up having to pay for your own medication in the future, and
Yeah.
it's some of it's cheaper than others, but none of it's cheap. So it can be very, very frustrating. But as I say, like so much of the way I've been able to get my head around the diagnosis is through talking to other people, and
Yeah.
that's generally free and readily available. If you're willing to be brave about it, and you're lucky enough to find people who are happy to talk about it. So
Oh, that's great.
um, yeah.
Yeah. This is a perfect time for us to get onto the last part of the podcast, which always ends on the fun note, and just talk about games, and obviously the games that kind of like have impacted you, whether in a meaningful way, whether that's just through pure joy or just like because they've done something quite unique that you love. So, is there a game that you would instantly go to if somebody asked you, like, oh, the Fables, what's your favorite game question?
Yeah, I think my kind of go-to answer is Dwarf Fortress,
Okay.
which is it's an incredible game. It's been being made over the last, I think, 13, 14, maybe even 15 years now by one guy and his brother, Tarn and Zach Adams. They're obviously indie developers, American indie developers. They've built this incredibly complex kind of simulation sort of stroke management game called Dwarf Fortress, where you get 7 dwarves and you wander off and you dig a hole and you live in it until something comes to kill you, basically. Um, it's I mean, I first got into it because I was able to download it and play it on any computer. It was, you know, it was all done in ASCII, so it was all relatively low demand on resources. It also, because it looks like a spreadsheet, meant that I could quite often get away with playing it when I was supposed to be working. But it's a phenomenal achievement, you know. Like it's one of those kind of games that I think will be a real reference point for kind of the history of games once we kind of get to that point, you know, when people are talking about the fundamental way that games changed over the years, because it's just got this incredible procedural generation system where it creates entire worlds and pantheons and myths and legends every time you start the game. It's incredibly complicated and very, very fiddly, which, you know, for ADHD was perfect. It's very much got that kind of like just 10 more minutes kind of thing, because anything can kind of happen at any point. But just the achievement that it represents for the guys who've made it. I mean, I've met Tarn Adams a couple of times. He's a really, really lovely guy, and you know, really, really cares about the community. They are in the process now of actually making it for Steam. It's always been funded by donations. It's free to download.
Oh wow.
So they're just about to hopefully release it for Steam this year or maybe early next. Under the due date on Steam, I think it says "Time is an illusion." So,
A game development, definitely.
yeah. So when it'll actually come out, I don't know, but it's absolutely amazing. I'd recommend everyone to try it. As I say, it's free. It's absolutely mind-blowing, the complexity and the passion and love that's gone into it. So I think that would probably be what I'd say was my go-to favorite. I also played a hell of a lot of the Total Warhammer games.
Yeah.
I used to absolutely love, you know, I was always a kind of Nintendo kid growing up. I think if I tried to remember, like, I was looking at your points in the email about, you know, what's your fondest memory of games, and, you know, as someone with ADHD and aphantasia, memories are not strong for me. They are. I don't have a lot of strong memories, and virtually none of them have visual qualities when I remember them, because I don't form visual memories in the same way. But I do very much remember sitting in the car, having just bought Zelda: Link to the Past on SNES when I was a kid, and sitting in the car park of Sainsbury's while my mum went in to do the grocery shopping, and just desperately, just being so desperate to get home and play this game. I can remember the smell of the manual, you know, sitting and reading this manual back to back, and just being so desperate to get home and play. I can remember the smell of the glue on it. And that's it's such, not just a strong games memory, but it's such a strong memory for me anyway. When I don't have many of those, it's really quite a special kind of thing for me to be able to kind of revisit that in my head. You know, that happy point of my childhood. It's such a rare thing for me to be able to do. That's actually a weirdly important memory for me. You know, this idea of just sitting in a car park reading a 12-page manual and not even playing the game itself, you know. It's bizarre, but that is one of the strongest memories I have to associate with gaming. I mean, I love the game, and I remember, you know, playing bits of it, but that is by far the strongest memory I have associated with it, which is quite strange.
Yeah, I definitely have that sort of feeling of, like, you know, sort of childhood memories are very intricately linked into a gaming moment. Like, you know, I always vividly remember, like, coming downstairs to see my mum has been up all night playing Crash Bandicoot, unlocking all the gems and hidden levels. I just remember her just looking knackered because she obviously have to go to work like straight after that and take us to school and stuff. So yeah, it's funny that kind of, it's always sort of like linked in with me in terms of, like, you know, a childhood memory. Just that sort of, like, you know, seeing my mum sort of being so obsessed with a video game when she's not a gamer in my eyes, and and it's just that sort of like, oh wow.
Yeah, I think that those, I mean, memories of, like, especially seeing your parents get into games is really fascinating. And I mean, my stepdad bought me my Spectrum when I was, I don't know, 7, I suppose 6 or 7, and then bought me my SNES when I was sort of 11 or 12. And again, you know, those are really special memories, especially sitting with a parent and actually enjoying enjoying games, and like you say, coming and finding a parent playing games on their own. Like, I think that's such a strong identification moment to just go, oh wow, you're actually just like me. You like this stuff. You're not just a person who's there to tell me off and make me do stuff I don't like. Yeah, I think that's a really nice moment.
Yeah. So yeah, that's pretty much all we have time for this week. So it's great chatting with you. And I think even just sharing your sort of like personal history with like ADHD really will sort of help other people kind of either their own sort of getting used to the idea of ADHD themselves and how that interlocks into their life.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. Yeah, I mean, I'm always happy to answer questions on it. So, I mean, you can find me on Twitter at Danbo Jones. You can find me in the UK Games Industry Slack. Always happy to answer questions and offer what help I can with anything related to that. So.
And that's perfectly answered my second question of where people can find you. So, yeah. That's great. So yeah, that is pretty much all we have time for. New episodes obviously every 2 weeks. So make sure you subscribe, do all the podcasty things and make us grow, all the social media words that the young kids know. And yeah, I can't wait to see you next time when we have a new guest who also identifies in the disabled or neurodiverse communities who are happy to work in games. So keep tuned. So see you next time. Bye. Thanks again, Dan, and make sure you follow him online. All links will be in the description. Make sure you follow DNA of Games on iTunes, Spotify or YouTube, as well as finding us under Twitter at MiniCatCIC. So join the discussion online. See you next time.